Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about DUNU's new pair of tribrids. This is the 142 and this is the 242. So shell-wise, they actually look very similar, just different color schemes. So this is 142. They said these are Headgear's 3D printed shells. It's kind of hard to tell. Usually they feel a little bit different. These are very polished. They feel really solid. Really nicely done for a pair of 3D printed shells. This is the 242. It's got kind of this little fancier bezel around it, but generally it's very similar to what you're going to get on 242. I think the nozzles are slightly different as well. So this is kind of a different style, and they may actually be slightly different sizes as well. I think that 242 was just slightly smaller than 142, but I didn't actually measure it. But putting on tips and taking off tips, I think it actually worked out a little bit easier on 242 than it did on 142. If you are familiar with DUNU, you know that inside the box you're going to get a great modular cable, which is this, and I think it's the same cable on both of these sets. You are going to get a case. You are going to get really nice sets of tips, and I'm sure other people have covered those, so I won't cover those in detail, but we'll kind of jump into it, and we'll maybe push these out of the way that way and start with the graphs. And these are DUNU's graph. And again, I'll say that when possible, when you're talking about planners or microplanners, do refer back to the brand's graph, because those tend to be a little bit more accurate than anything I can do or anything that anyone else can do on Squig. And if you're trying to compare these particular sets, it's really a much better choice to go back to the brand's graphs, to DUNU's graphs, than it is to go back to anything on Squig, because they look further apart on Squig than they do on DUNU's graphs. If you look at DUNU's graphs, they essentially, this is 242, this is 142. What kind of jumps out at you on 142 is this, right? 142 has a lot more bass. It's a much more fun set. 242 looks a little bit dipped. It's going to be cleaner and leaner, maybe thinner. And, that's kind of a first look at what their graphs are, but it's really hard to tell what the differences actually are, especially when they align them this way. So later I'll actually show you, you can actually trace these, put them on the same graph, and actually see what the differences are. And I'll say that, yeah, part of it is that the base shells are slightly different. But if you align them differently, right, this looks a little bit dipped. It's actually below. This is kind of right on the line. So they've aligned them at 1K, and that makes it appear, it kind of accentuates the difference between on the base shelves. But then when you look at the ear gain region and kind of this lower treble, the way this one peaks a little bit later, or it peaks a little bit earlier, this one's a little bit later. This is actually a little bit dipped here. There actually are differences between the two that we'll talk about later. And again, I'll just say, go back and refer to DUNU's graphs. Don't refer to my graph, because their graphs are going to be way more accurate. So let's push these out of the way so we can actually see something, get some notes going. We'll move 142 over there. 242 we'll leave over here at some point. So what are they? Again, those of you who've been looking at these pair of sets, you probably already know this. 242 is a dual dynamic driver. It's a 10mm and an 8mm. It's a 4-balance armature, 2 microplanar set. The sensitivity is about 110. On the 142, it's a single dynamic driver, so I think it's a single 10mm. It's a 4-balance armature and 2 microplanars, but the sensitivity is actually 107. And I will say right out of the box, what I noticed is that 142 is actually quite a bit harder to drive. You will definitely, if you try to switch back and forth between the two, you will definitely end up turning up the volume on 142 to match what it is on 242. It's just something that you take into account. You will need a little bit more volume. It's not hard to drive, but it will require a little bit more volume to drive 142. So kind of right off the bat, is 242 the one? And I'll say by the one, I mean, is it the first tribrid microplanar that doesn't need EQ? And I'll say yes. For me, it is the first one that I haven't really EQ'd. I'll get into the EQ on 142 and kind of towards the end, at the end. But 242 is the one that I've actually used without EQ. This is kind of a first for me, the first microplanar tribrid, going all the way back through Dusk, Braindance, Daybreak, Meta. Meta wasn't a microplanar, but it kind of resembled it. P50, all of these microplanar sets, this kind of leading up until the point of even Horizon, which we'll talk about in a second, these are all sets that needed some kind of tweaking, and over time it became less and less amount of EQ, less and less amount of tweaking to get to the point where I felt comfortable with them. 242 is probably the first one where I just used it as is. So yeah, I will say 242 is the one. And which is better out of 242 and 142? For me, it's actually 242. And I'll say 242 is just slightly better balanced end to end. But again, the two are frustratingly close, as you just saw on the graph. There's not a ton of differences between the two. They're just slight differences between them, and we'll get into that later as well. But as I said, when you look at the graphs, is the bass lacking on 242? Is 142, the fun one? When we look at the graph, it looks like it was certainly going to be the fun one, right? It's got this really big bass shelf. It's a little bit over 10 dB. This one's about 5 dB. So 142 should be kind of the fun one. But I'll say no, I don't think 242 is actually lacking any bass. But in this style where you have 5 dB of ear gain, right? So the important part on this isn't so much that this is 12 dB versus 5 dB. Sort of part of it, what's a little bit more important is the ear gain, right? How much bass do you need to get over the ear gain? Both of them are at 5 dB. This one is almost perfectly balanced at 5 dB and 5 dB. This one's about whatever, that's like 11 dB and maybe about 6 dB. So yeah, this one, the 142 is slightly tilted, but the end-to-end balance on 242 is probably spot on. It's really, really nice. And for me, that just kind of stands out as better balance, just kind of affects a lot of other things. And for me, 242 is the one that kind of sounds end-to-end better in that respect. And as I just said, I don't want 10 dB at 20 hertz on a 5 dB ear gain set. It ends up masking the upper range. That's sort of what happens on 142. It's definitely a more fun style sound, but I don't necessarily need a full 10 dB or more at 20 hertz on something that doesn't have any boost to it at all, right? So when we look at the upper range on the two, like these two essentially aren't all that far from each other. This boost is essentially going to mask a lot of what you can hear out here. They could have boosted this so you can get over this, which they didn't. They just sort of tilted this and just put a little bit more of a fun bass. But when you look at these two in balance the way they are on 242 and you hear it this way, you can basically hear everything. Whereas this one, it's kind of not quite because of the two tweaks that they did to it. And we'll get into that as well. But yeah, end to end, I think 242 is the better set for me anyway. So why does 242 actually sound better? The mids are slightly more forward. They're more transparent. They were revealed with more dimension and depth is what I would say. It's just better than other microplanar sets, not just the 142. Again, going back in history, how we kind of got here with these tribrid microplanars, each one kind of got better and better. And as I said with Horizon, each microplanar set got better, more refined, but the gap is growing between these current sets, the 242s, the Horizons, some of the recent microplanars, even Daybreak. When you compare those to the older sets, that gap is really growing, and that gap is really sounding more natural while retaining speed, separation, and layering. Like all the technical bits that you are expecting to have come across on microplanars, but sounding natural at the same time. That has always been the grail of the tribrid with the microplanars. So 242 is getting really, really close as far as sounding natural, but still retaining all of those technical bits. And Horizon, again, I was going to say this about Horizon. Is it better than Horizon? And I'll say yes, it's better than Horizon because of the sibilance, and those S's just kill me on Horizon. And I went back and listened to Horizon when I was listening to 242. It just needs EQ, and the S's kind of pop out right away. It's hard to kind of listen to that set and enjoy it without EQ for me. So yeah, I'll say kind of right away it's better than Horizon in that respect. Is it better than Braindance? And I'll say no, those are two different style sets. I think Braindance appeals to people who are like a little bit more intense treble. They like a lot of that extension, what Braindance is really good at. The treble goes downhill on 142 and 242, and I don't mean downhill in a bad way. I mean the way this kind of carries down in this sloping downhill manner is just a little bit different than Braindance. Braindance kind of carries it out a little bit, kind of at a higher level is what it sounds like in ear. And again, I don't even know if those two graph the same as this, but I'll say in ear, Brain Dance carries out a lot more energy through upper treble. These two kind of slope down in a way that is going to be more general appealing to most people. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it's better than Brain Dance, but I'll say it'll appeal to more people, but it's definitely a different style set. And I'm mostly going to talk about 242 because that was my favorite one of the two, and I will talk about 142 later as we get into kind of the after show on this one. So the bass on 242, again, bouncy, really tuned for quality. It's partly why 242 is better balanced end to end. Is it for hip hop fans, for really kind of not bass head, but really heavier bass genres? I'll say no, it's not quite there, but it's really for people who want the bass to hit, not like hitting a pillow. Those of you who have heard these softer, or when I talked about that dip, the way 242 actually looks on the graph, the way people kind of pointed, it's going to be dipped, it's not going to have any mid bass, it's going to have really soft impact. That's not actually what comes across on 242. It actually hits quite hard. For those of you who turn up the volume, it actually hits surprisingly hard if you turn the knob to the right. But again, I'm not a big fan of really soft impact. I'm not a fan of that dipped impact where the impact kind of goes away. I'm not a fan of impact with a lot of sub bass follow on. I like hits to sound like hits. That's kind of what comes across on 242. 242 does have great imaging and it sounds huge, and that comes from proper bass levels, really tight bass control. But as I said, not on the graph. There's more thump, there's more weight to it, there's more body than it appears, especially when you turn up the volume. The bass scales up faster than the treble, as it should. And again, it's just really hard to see on the graph. The microplaners need slightly more body. Otherwise, they thin out really quickly. There's more on the 242 than it appears on the graph. And I can't even point to the graph and say, oh, look, it's magically here somewhere. There's more there in here than it is. And again, I'll say part of the reason why this gap is growing is partly is due to the fact that people are realizing that you do need a little bit more lower end body to balance out all that extension, all that kind of thinness that comes along with not only balanced armatures, but also the microplaner. You need this lower end balance for all of that upper range, and you kind of get that by a little bit more low end body. So again, the gap and why each set sounds better than the previous one is people are trying to figure out how to find that balance and make the two sound more natural. That's kind of where we are with 242. The mids, and again, I'll say noticeable on both sets. More transparency and clarity than I was expecting. Even on 142, it's very transparent, very clear. 242 with that lower bass level just kind of reveals the mids in a way that required drivers and tuning to really shine. And that's kind of what really kind of popped out on 242, man. It really sounds really good right in the mids. Very resolving, very clear, a lot of clarity because of the bass level on 242. But I will say that's exactly, everything really had to be on point, but that's exactly where Horizon had the issue, right? It kind of opened its robe and said, hey, look, check out all of this stuff. And sibilants popped out, right? These hard S's, the hard C's didn't really sound right. Too hard on Horizon, and you just have to EQ those out. But it was a really, really nice set. It was the right idea, but the point at which you reveal the mids in that way, they've got to really be polished, and that's kind of what happened on 242. There's nothing hiding under the bass. So the weight and the shout and the thinness all had to be polished out on 242. They did a really, really good job on that. 142 definitely has a little bit more bass. They dipped that upper mid rise. They didn't quite open the robe enough the way that 242 did. It's actually pretty close, but they still kind of hit under the bass a little bit. They pulled back the upper mid rise a little bit, and that's kind of going to give you a little bit of a kind of a softer edge to it. So, and I'll say 242, it's not unforgiving, but there are really moments where 242 is just kind of brutally transparent. You're in the room, but very close. And that was sort of what was missing on 142. 142 had it kind of softer, didn't quite have that hard edge to it, didn't quite sound as forward as 242, but it sounds good in the way that it did it. But there are moments where 242 just sounds like brutally close. And part of what I was missing on 142, I kind of wanted the middle ground between the two, but Nine Inch Nails, Piggy, when Trent Reznor, that opening bit when he is kind of whispering to you, it's like, yeah, part of that is it needs to sound like him. It can't be a recording of him. You want his presence to be in your ear, like he's standing like 6 inches from you. And sometimes that can be a little bit too close, but sometimes it comes across as just very in the room, very present, very real. And that's sort of what comes across on 242. A little bit of what I was missing on 142, but then a track like Lil Wayne's right above it, right? It's the soundtrack, the theme song to Ballers, for those of you who remember that show. Man, that's a really hard track to actually pull off on a lot of sets, especially the microplaners. That's like one of those tracks that I wouldn't bother on Braindance. It's just kind of too intense. But on 242, where you have the space and you have that kind of room to breathe around the vocals, they are slightly forward, but the treble runs downhill. The whole thing sounds really, really resolved. There's tons of space. There's great separation, layered, uncluttered. That's sort of the problem on most IEMs with that particular track. There's just a lot there, and it comes across as compressed or cluttered. There's too much on top of each other. It's not quite layered and separated. 242 is probably one of the few sets that I've actually heard that where Lil Wayne is actually right there out in front. There's lots of space around his voice. You don't have all of the other samples kind of bunching in around his vocals. He is offset, clear, very resolved, space, separated, layered. Done really, really well on 242. It kind of surprised me how well that was actually done on 242. And the treble, again, as I said, running downhill from that ear gain peak, I don't have a problem with that. You really need to do that on the microplaners. Again, why is 242 better balanced? That upper treble is extended without the boost. If you're sensitive to balanced armatures and microplanar timbre, again, that's what's here. If you're sensitive to that, it's kind of hard to get around it. DUNU didn't really try to overdampen or pull back any part of the upper range. There's just a lot of control, and you dip the microplaners so they sound more natural. This has been this ongoing trend. And again, when we look at it on the graph and you see basically this 10K notch, right? It drops and then it carries over, it drops and it carries over. That's essentially what you should see on microplaners, and that kind of gives you that, take that kind of that Braindance edge off, even though Braindance I think actually does have a notch that looks sort of similar to that. The way this one kind of runs downhill and notches, that's sort of what you want to hear. You don't want this whole bit to be too far forward, to be too present, because that's going to give you that artificial edge that people didn't like on the original earlier microplanar set. So every one of these newer sets is sort of doing this in the same style. You kind of have this nice arcing treble. When you get to the upper treble, you kind of pull the microplaners back just a little bit more than you would unbalanced armatures, so they don't stick out, they don't sound unnatural, they don't have that too much planarness to them. So again, each one of these sets is learning from the previous one and really adjusting this balance between the balanced armatures and the microplanar transition, and that's kind of what you hear on 242 and 142. Stage, again, really where you hear the difference on how well balanced 242 is. 142 is really close, but just not quite there. 242 sounds very big through balance, which is a special skill. Again, these tunings on both of these, they didn't really boost anything. You can kind of say that 142 boosted the bass, but as far as 5 dB, kind of notch, cut, extend, 242 is done end to end very, very well. There is no boost to make the sound wider. There is no boost to kind of bring this so far forward. There isn't a boost kind of to hide anything. Stage-wise, this thing is just very revealed end to end, in balance. And when I hear that, it tends to come across on stage as going to sound really huge, a lot of depth, a lot of dimension. That's kind of what 242 comes across as. 142, pretty close. This is a little bit too much. That's going to kind of cloud the imaging and the stage. This is a little bit later, not quite far enough forward. You don't quite get the depth and the dimension to the vocals that you do on 242, but this part is actually done quite well. They didn't really have to boost that to make it sound any wider or bigger. 142 was kind of fine in that respect. So that is a lot on 242. So now let's talk about 142 in particular. So I just kind of said the 242 was my favorite, and it's a great set and it's the one and all that stuff. So what happens if you bought 142? was it the wrong choice? And I'll say absolutely no. They are frustratingly close, as I said. They're just not the same. When I heard 242, this is kind of right along with my preferences. I just wanted 142 to be a little bit closer to 242, and that's sort of my main complaint with 142. It's kind of why I didn't talk about it too much. I think there's just a little bits that were a little bit different. Every time I listen to 242, then kind of switch back to 142, I'm like, why couldn't they just do this? They are very, very close when you start to look at them and really listen to them. So, but is 142 the smoother one? You know, I think some people will find 142 the smoother one. It's certainly got the better bass shelf for those of you who want more bass. So I think it does appeal to, you know, quite a bit of people. And I'll say, yeah, in that respect, I think it probably is the smoother one. But really be careful with what you ask for, and how they got there does matter. And that's sort of what I'll talk about now, is how they got 142 to sound a little bit smoother. And as I said, if you actually trace out their version of their graph of 142, their version of 242, and the green is my EQ. When you look at the bits that are kind of set apart, where the red graph is set apart from the blue graph, you can kind of see the two parts that they adjusted on 142 that are slightly different than 242. So the one that's kind of obvious on the graph is, 142 does have this bigger bass shelf, and that's fine. That's lots of fun. What isn't as obvious is kind of the way they inset in this, kind of reduce the upper mid rise, kind of right where the vocals hit, right where I said that the 242 vocals, very transparent, very clear, slightly forward. Those are pulled back on 142. And that little bit kind of threw me off. And I kept on hearing vocals on 242. And I'm like, why didn't they just do that? They have a lot of transparency on 142. They just kind of pulled it back in a way that you can describe that as smooth, but I'm paying $249 for 7 drivers or 8 drivers. Either way, you're paying a lot of money. Like, why pull this back in a way that it's just kind of a tuning change? There isn't really technically any reason why that 142 couldn't sound just as nice as 242 in this respect. They just chose to do that, and that kind of change just kind of threw me off. So quick EQ to kind of push them back in place. So 1 PEQ just to move this. So if you look at the green line, I basically have a green low shelf that kind of cuts between the two. You don't really have to go all the way down to where 242 is. You can actually leave 142 where it is. That's fine. I just kind of threw that in there so you can play with it. But the other one, take 1500, a 2 decibel gain, which is actually probably not right. That's probably supposed to be... again, these are kind of reversed because I did a low shelf. So if you do a low shelf and then you do 2 positives, it will actually bump this number wrong way. So try that, make sure it works. Make sure you see that I know what I did. Ignore what I just said. So I was thinking that was actually reversed, but this is a 2 decibel gain in that direction. So 142 dipped right there. I added 2 dB to put it right in place where I added 2 dB on 142 to put it right where 242 is. This is getting super confusing, and I've been talking for a long time, so sorry about that. But yeah, these two are actually right. So minus 2 dB on the red to bring it in between the two, plus 2 dB between the two to raise that upper mid, that kind of ear gain region, just to put it right in place where 242 is. And again, I'll say that DUNU normalized their graphs at 1K, and that didn't quite match the differences that I heard in sound. And a track to kind of help you EQ this particular change, Lola Young's Messy. And I talk about the IAM experience occasionally. You take a track that you should sound like the first time you heard it, despite hearing it everywhere, right? That was a track that was everywhere for quite a bit of time. You probably heard it in the car, on the radio, some version on your phone. You just heard it around because it was played so often. And when you pick up a really nice IEM, whether it's 242 or 142, you should notice things right away in the first minute of that track that you haven't heard before because you haven't heard it on an IEM. And that's exactly what popped out to me on 242. And then when I heard it on 142, I'm like, yeah, this is really, really close. It's not quite 242, but it's not going to be too hard to push it very, very close to 242. And that's exactly what I did there. And in my opinion, I think most of the difference is this relaxed rise on 142. You can certainly drop the bass a bit or not much. It's kind of up to you. But this is the change where 142 really starts to stage like 242, where you should really hear that upper treble contribution, more dimension to the mids. That first minute of the song where you're hearing kind of the decays and the reverbs and kind of the resonance to the first minute of that song, parts that were missing on 142, you EQ them, put them back in place, and they start to come through the way they do on 242. So again, I'll say this is mainly a way to close the gap between 142 and 242, where I could forget which one I was actually listening to. But you can also EQ 142 on its own to your preferences. That's fine. I don't have any problem with that. I just wanted to do something that I was kind of frustrated that these were close, but not close enough. And again, I'll say that 142 just needs a little bit more volume, so this gets a little bit more complicated because you need to turn up the volume in between the two if you happen to have both of them. If you just have 142, ignore that because you're not going to know that it actually requires a little bit more volume than that one. So that was a long one, and thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.